Carl Jung spent decades studying the psychology of narcissism, and he uncovered something that completely contradicts what most psychologists believe. The root cause of narcissism isn't excessive praise. It's not coddling. It's not raising a child to believe they are special. It's actually the opposite. It's making a child feel deep down in their soul that they are inadequate, insufficient, fundamentally flawed. And this message, when internalized before the age of 7, doesn't just create low self-esteem, it creates something far more devastating. It creates a catastrophic split in the psyche, what Jung called fragmentation of the self. And from this fragmentation, narcissism emerges not as mere vanity, but as a psychological survival strategy, a way to cope with a wound the child can't even name, but carries for the rest of their life. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how narcissistic parents use subtle and repeated messages to instill existential shame in their children. How this shame creates the primary narcissistic wound, the very wound Jung identified as the origin of all narcissistic structures. You'll see how the child's true self is buried in the shadow, while a compensatory false self dominates their conscious life, either inflated in grandiosity or collapsed in self-effacement. And most importantly, you'll understand why this wound is so difficult to heal, and what Jung discovered about the only possible path to integration. Because if you grew up feeling like you were never enough, no matter what you did, this video will give a name to the wound you carry, and naming it is the first step to freedom. Existential shame isn't about what you did, it's about who you are. Guilt says you did something wrong. Shame says you are something wrong. And when narcissistic parents implant this shame into the core of a child's identity, they don't do it through obvious abuse. They do it through micro-messages, repeated 1,000 times, looks of disappointment, a tone of voice dripping with disapproval, destructive comparisons, conditional love disguised as care, systematic invalidation of who the child really is, and the child, who is utterly dependent on these parents for survival, can't reject the message. So they internalize it, and this internalization creates what Jung called the primary inadequacy complex, an autonomous psychic core that takes control of their self-perception for the rest of their life. Always saying, no matter what you achieve, that you're not enough, that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, that you need to strive harder, be more, do more, just to earn the right to exist. And from this complex, narcissism emerges. As a desperate compensation for this unbearable primary wound, let me show you how this works through a real case study that Jung himself might have analyzed. I'll call her Emily. At 6 years old, Emily was an extraordinarily sensitive child. She cried easily, felt everything deeply, was moved by music, marveled at small things, like butterflies or sunsets, and she had an intense need for emotional connection with her mother. But Emily's mother, who had her own unresolved issues, couldn't tolerate all that emotional intensity, so every time Emily showed sensitivity, her mother reacted with micro-expressions of disapproval, a raised eyebrow, a sigh of frustration, a look away, or she verbalized it directly. "You're so dramatic, Emily. You exaggerate everything. Why can't you be normal, like other kids? Stop being so sensitive. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." And something devastating began to happen in Emily's psyche. She began to understand, at age 6, that the most authentic part of her deep sensitivity, was unacceptable, flawed, inadequate. And she faced an impossible choice, a choice no child should ever have to make: maintain connection with who she really was, her sensitive, true self, or maintain connection with her mother, which meant emotional and physical survival. And like every child in that position, Emily chose survival. She killed a part of herself, buried her sensitive, true self in the shadow, and began to build a false self that her mother could accept, a rational self, controlled, without intense emotions, without visible emotional needs, a self that performed being what her mother wanted instead of being who she was. But here's what Jung discovered that is absolutely critical to understand. When the true self goes into the shadow like that, it doesn't disappear. It stays there buried, trying to survive, and the psyche, to compensate for this catastrophic fragmentation, to compensate for the loss of the authentic core, develops a defensive structure. And that defensive structure is narcissism. In Emily's case, she developed covert narcissism. She disappeared emotionally, lived decades without accessing her own sensitivity, shallow relationships, inability to connect deeply, a chronic sense of emptiness, and on the outside, to any external observer, she seemed normal, functional, even successful, but on the inside, there was a hole, a void where her true self should have been, and she expended enormous psychic energy just to maintain the fragmentation, to ensure that the sensitive part never emerged, because emerging meant reliving the unbearable primary shame, the internalized message that sensitivity was a flaw. That being who she was meant being rejected. Hold on, because the next mechanism I'm going to show you is even more invisible and devastating. Emily grew up, became an adult, got married, had children, and something interesting began to happen. Every time Emily's daughter showed emotional sensitivity, Emily felt a visceral aversion. She couldn't tolerate it. She became irritated, impatient, began to invalidate her daughter exactly as she had been invalidated. And she didn't do it consciously. She didn't think she was repeating her mother's pattern. In fact, she thought she was protecting her daughter, teaching her to be strong, not to be dramatic, to control her emotions. But what was really happening, and this is crucial to understanding the generational transmission of narcissism, was shadow projection. The sensitivity that Emily buried in herself, that went into the shadow decades ago, was now being projected onto her daughter and attacked in her daughter, because Jung discovered that the shadow always attacks in others what has been repressed in oneself. Emily couldn't tolerate sensitivity in her daughter because she couldn't tolerate it in herself. The mother's unhealed wound created an identical wound in the child. The cycle perpetuated automatically, unconsciously. And another generation grew up with the message that being sensitive is being inadequate. But why does this specific message, inadequacy, create narcissism instead of just low self-esteem? Jung explains this through the concept of the true self versus the compensatory false self. When a child internalizes the belief that they are inadequate, they can't simply accept it and live with low self-esteem, because inadequacy at the core of their being is psychologically unbearable. So the psyche does something intelligent but destructive. It creates a compensation, an alternate self, a self that is not inadequate. And this compensatory self can go in two directions. It can inflate, becoming grandiose, the classic narcissist who needs to constantly prove that they are not only adequate but superior, that they are special, that they are better than everyone else. Or it can collapse, becoming invisible. The covert narcissist who disappears emotionally, who never takes risks, who never exposes themselves, because exposure means the possibility of confirming that primary inadequacy. Both are narcissism, both are reactions to the same wound. The existential shame installed by narcissistic parents, And here's what most people don't understand about narcissism. It's not about thinking you're better than everyone else. It's about not being able to tolerate the possibility of being inadequate. The grandiose narcissist needs constant external validation, not because they are vain, but because underneath the grandiosity, there is a hole. The primary inadequacy that was never healed, and the grandiosity is the psychological band-aid over that wound. Remove the grandiosity, and what remains is the hole, the existential shame. The message internalized at 6 years old that something is fundamentally wrong with you. And the same goes for the covert narcissist. The emotional invisibility is not modesty. It's protection, a defense against the possibility of exposure that would confirm the inadequacy. Both lives dominated by the same complex. The primary narcissistic wound, the catastrophic division of the self installed in childhood. According to Carl Jung, these early experiences shape our perception of self and others. Let me show you the next level of how this works. Emily, at 32, had a narcissistic collapse. And a narcissistic collapse happens when the compensatory false self can no longer sustain the defense, when the primary wound starts to bleed through the cracks. In her case, it was when her husband ended the relationship and said something devastating as he left. "You were never really present. It was like living with a ghost. I never truly knew you." And those words pierced Emily's narcissistic defense because they confirmed for the first time in decades the buried truth. She really wasn't present, had disappeared emotionally at 6 years old, and never returned. The sensitive true self was buried in the shadow. What her husband knew for years was only the performative false self, the mask, the adaptive persona. And when Emily was forced to confront that truth, the false self began to crack, and underneath emerged the unbearable primary shame, the inadequacy that she spent 26 years avoiding feeling. And Carl Jung would say that this moment, although devastating, was necessary, because without confronting the original wound, without feeling the full pain of the fragmentation, there is no possibility of integration, there is no healing. Only infinite maintenance of the narcissistic defense, which consumes all psychic energy and prevents authentic life. But wait, because what happened next in Emily's therapy reveals something that Carl Jung considered absolutely essential about recovery. Emily started Jungian therapy, and in the first sessions, something happened that she didn't expect. When the therapist asked her to talk about her childhood, about her mother, Emily started to cry. Not normal crying. Deep crying, visceral, somatic, as if something buried for decades was finally emerging. And between sobs, she said something revealing. I was never enough for her. No matter what I did, I could get perfect grades, behave perfectly, do everything right, but I always felt that something in me was wrong, that I was a disappointment, that if I were different, if I were less sensitive, less emotional, less intense, maybe she would really love me. And the therapist did something simple but transformative. She validated her, said that there was nothing wrong with Emily's sensitivity, that sensitivity was part of her true self, that it was the mother, with her own unresolved wounds, who couldn't tolerate it. And that validation, for the first time in Emily's life, started to create cracks in the inadequacy complex, started to question the message internalized 26 years ago, and opened the possibility, for the first time, that maybe the problem was never her, maybe it was her mother's inability to see who she really was. But Carl Jung knew that external validation, although necessary, is not enough. Because the inadequacy complex is not just in the conscious mind, it's in the unconscious, automated, running in the background for decades. So Emily needed to do something much more difficult. She needed to actively confront the shadow. She needed to bring back to consciousness all the parts of the true self that were buried, the sensitivity, the emotional intensity, the need for deep connection, the tears, the vulnerability, everything that was labeled as inadequate and exiled. And this process, which Carl Jung called shadow integration, is not comfortable, because it means feeling all the emotions that were repressed. It means reliving the primary shame. It means confronting the childhood terror that being authentic meant losing her mother. But this time, as an adult, with psychological resources she didn't have at 6 years old, Emily could make a different choice. She could choose the true self instead of survival through the false self. She could tolerate the shame, process it emotionally, and discover that on the other side of the shame there was no annihilation. There was liberation, wholeness, integration. And here's what started to change in Emily's life through this process. First, she began to recognize when she was operating from the false self versus the true self. She noticed when she was performing emotionally instead of feeling genuinely, when she was saying yes but wanting to say no, when she was disappearing in relationships instead of showing who she really was. And more importantly, she started to make micro-choices, different, small betrayals of the inadequacy complex, sharing a vulnerable emotion with a friend, saying no when she wanted to say no, crying when she felt like it instead of repressing it, asking for what she needed instead of disappearing. And each micro-choice was terrifying because it activated the primary terror. Being authentic means being rejected, but each time she chose authenticity and wasn't annihilated, the complex lost strength. The mother's message, "You are inadequate," began to lose power over her psyche. And the true self, buried for 26 years, began to emerge from the shadow. But there was a moment that was absolutely transformative for Emily. And this moment reveals something profound about how narcissism heals in practice. One day, Emily's 7-year-old daughter came home crying because a friend said she was too sensitive. And Emily felt it, as always, that visceral aversion, the urge to tell her daughter to stop crying, to control her emotions, to be strong. But this time, Emily stopped. She recognized that it wasn't her voice, it was her mother's voice, the unresolved complex wanting to perpetuate the cycle. And she made a different choice. She knelt down in front of her daughter, looked her in the eyes, and said something she had never heard in her childhood. "There is nothing wrong with you. Your sensitivity is beautiful. It's who you are. And it's okay to cry. It's okay to feel deeply. I love you exactly as you are." And as she said these words to her daughter, Emily realized she was saying them to herself, to the 6-year-old buried inside her. And it was this moment of conscious reparenting, of actively breaking the generational cycle, that began the true healing of the narcissistic wound. Because Carl Jung knew that you don't heal complexes just by understanding them intellectually. You heal them by living differently, by consciously choosing differently, crack after crack in the automated pattern, until it finally loses control over you. Now, let me show you how to recognize if you carry this specific wound. Because inadequacy as a cause of narcissism has very particular signs. First, there's a compulsive search for external validation, but not validation about actions, validation about existence. You need to hear that you are enough, that you are good, that you have value. And no matter how many times you hear it, it never sticks. Because the whole isn't in the present. It's when you were 6 years old. It's the child who was never seen as adequate who remains hungry. And you can have hundreds of people telling you that you are amazing. but just one person questioning you, and it's that voice that keeps echoing, because that voice confirms what you have always believed deep down, that you are not enough. Second, there's paralyzing perfectionism. Not healthy perfectionism of wanting to do well, but defensive perfectionism, terror of failing, because failure would confirm the primary inadequacy. So you procrastinate, avoid, don't finish projects. Because as long as you don't try, you can't confirm that you are inadequate. And this creates a vicious cycle. You have enormous potential, but never fully realize it. And the non-realization feeds the inadequacy, which feeds the defensive perfectionism, which prevents realization. Carl Jung would call this an autonomous complex running in a loop, controlling your life without you realizing it. Third, there's constant destructive comparison. You compare yourself with everyone and always come out losing because you are not comparing abilities. You are comparing existential value, and you've already decided at age 6 that your value is inferior. The comparison only confirms what you already believe. You see someone successful and don't think they worked hard or got lucky. You think they are fundamentally better, more adequate, and you are fundamentally worse. And this comparison is constant torture. Because today, with social media, you are exposed to infinite comparisons, and each one cuts a little deeper into the primary wound. Fourth, there's collapse in the face of criticism. Normal constructive criticism destroys you because you don't hear feedback about action. You hear confirmation of inadequacy. The criticism directly activates the primary complex, and you can spend days, weeks, ruminating over a small criticism while completely ignoring 10 compliments, because the complex has a confirmation bias. It seeks evidence of inadequacy and discards evidence of adequacy. This isn't masochism. It's the complex protecting itself. Because if you accepted that you are adequate, the complex would lose its reason to exist. And complexes fight to survive. Fifth, there's self-sabotage in moments of success. Carl Jung observed this constantly. People who are finally achieving success and suddenly do something that destroys everything, because success confirms adequacy, and adequacy contradicts the primary complex. So the complex sabotages. You start an unnecessary fight, procrastinate on an important project, make destructive choices, and then look back and think that you've confirmed that you are inadequate. But what really happened is that the complex forced you to confirm its narrative, its sophisticated internal manipulation, and it happens completely unconsciously. And finally, there's this chronic feeling of being an imposter, that people don't really know you, that if they saw who you really are, they'd discover that you are inadequate, and they'd leave. And this feeling isn't paranoia. It's the truth of your internal experience, because you really are hidden. The true self is in the shadows. What people know is the performative false self, and deep down, you know it, and live in fear of being discovered. And the more success you have in the false self, the more terrified you become, because now you have more to lose. The higher the persona climbs, the greater the fall if someone discovers what's underneath. This is the paradox of narcissism. External success increases internal terror, because it increases the distance between mask and reality. If you recognized any of these patterns, understand something essential. The wound of inadequacy doesn't heal through external achievements. You can have infinite success, infinite approval, and the wound continues to bleed. Because the wound isn't about what you do, it's about who you are. And as long as you believe in your unconscious core that who you are fundamentally is inadequate, no external achievement will fill the hole. Carl Jung would say that you are trying to heal a wound of the self through the ego, and it doesn't work. Ego is a social mask. Self is who you really are. And the only possible cure is to rescue the true self from the shadows, to bring back to consciousness all the authentic parts that were buried, and to make peace with the grounding truth. Your parents couldn't see you, couldn't love you unconditionally, and that wasn't because you were inadequate. It was because they had their own unhealed wounds, unresolved complexes, and they projected those wounds onto you. You were the screen for their shadow, and internalized it as truth about yourself. But it wasn't true. It never was. It was their limitation, their blindness. And when you finally understand this, not intellectually but viscerally, something changes. The shame begins to dissolve, because shame only survives in the dark. When you bring it to light, when you name it, when you see where it came from, it loses power. And you begin, for the first time in your life, to have the possibility of seeing yourself as you really are. Not inadequate, just human, imperfect but sufficient. And that sufficiency doesn't come from achievements. It comes from existing, from being. And when you finally allow that, when you finally stop trying to prove your worth and simply exist, the narcissism begins to dissolve, because it no longer needs to compensate for the whole. The whole is healing. You've just seen something that few videos about narcissism reveal. The truth about how existential shame in childhood creates the primary narcissistic wound. How does this wound cause fragmentation of the self? And how the only possible cure is conscious integration through reparenting and shadow work. This information is rare because it demands a deep dive into Carl Jung, which few undertake. It requires understanding developmental psychology, and it takes the courage to name truths about family dynamics that most prefer to ignore. Each video like this represents hours of research, of study, of translating dense Jungian concepts into accessible language, and a commitment to reveal truths that help people break free from generational cycles. If this video named something you carry, if it helped you understand the wound of inadequacy and the path to healing, the super thanks button down below is more than just financial support. It's you saying that this truth about the formation of narcissism needs to continue being revealed. That other people need to understand that inadequacy isn't who they are. It's what was installed in them. When you support this work, you're breaking the silence about wounds that families have hidden for generations, and allowing more content like this to be created. You're not just a spectator. You're a survivor seeking wholeness. And every act of support helps other survivors find their way back to their true self. And here is the ultimate truth about inadequacy that Carl Jung wanted you to understand. The wound does not define you. What your parents did is not who you are. You've carried their shame for decades. You believed the narrative that something was fundamentally wrong with you, and you built an entire life compensating for that lie. But at any moment, you can make a different choice. You can begin to question the internalized message. You can start to bring the true self out of the shadows, micro-choice after micro-choice, and it won't be linear. There will be relapses. Days when the primary inadequacy complex will scream loudly and you'll believe it again. But each time you consciously choose to see the truth that you've always been enough, just weren't seen, the complex loses strength and the true self gains space, until one day you wake up and realize you're no longer living to prove your worth. You're living simply because you exist. And that's the individuation that Carl Jung talked about. Not becoming perfect. Not eliminating all the wounds, but integrating, becoming whole, conscious, free from the compulsion to compensate for inadequacy that was never yours to begin with. And when you achieve that, when you finally see yourself as enough, something profound happens. You stop transmitting the wound. Your children grow up knowing they are adequate exactly as they are. The generational cycle breaks, and you not only heal yourself, you heal entire lineages, past and future. Because wholeness isn't just personal, it's archetypal. And when an individual heals from this primary wound, they contribute to collective healing. This is the true transformation that Carl Jung saw as possible, and it's available to you now, in this moment, through a choice. See the truth. You've always been enough, and always will be. What one word describes where you felt like you were never enough in your childhood? Comment just one word. And if you recognize that you carry this wound of primary inadequacy and want to know more about how to heal through shadow integration, type shadow in the comments. I'll know that this topic needs to be explored further.